Not every crime begins with a scream. Not every victim sees it coming. And sometimes, there is no intruder, no weapon, no struggle, just a voice, calm, measured, authoritative, a voice that sounds like help, but isn't. Imagine you're at work. It's a normal day. Orders are coming in, people are moving fast, nothing feels out of place. And then, the phone rings. You answer it, and without realizing it, that moment becomes the beginning of something you will never forget. It always started the same way. A completely ordinary shift. The kind of day no one would remember. Fast food kitchens humming with routine. Fryers cracking softly in the background. Cash registers opening and closing. Employees laughing between orders. Managers thinking about schedules, deliveries, end-of-day reports. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, just routine. And that's exactly why it worked. Because when everything feels normal, you don't question what comes next. The phone rings. A manager picks it up. "Hello, this is the manager speaking." On the other end, a man responds, calm, professional, confident. He introduces himself as a police officer. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just authority. He gives a name, a badge number, sometimes even a department, and immediately, the tone of the conversation changes. Because when someone says they're law enforcement, people listen. The caller doesn't rush. He doesn't threaten. He builds slowly, carefully. He explains that there has been a report, a complaint involving theft. Nothing dramatic, just a missing amount of money. And according to him, it leads back to someone inside the store. A young employee. A name is given, a description. Details that feel specific enough to be real. And that's the key. Because the more specific something sounds, the more believable it becomes. At this point, the manager isn't scared. They're cooperative, helpful, trying to do the right thing. So when the caller says, "I need your assistance with this matter," it doesn't feel strange. It feels expected. So the manager agrees. And the first instruction comes. Bring the employee into a private area. Simple, reasonable, something that makes sense in a workplace setting. So they do it, without hesitation. The employee is called in, confused, unsure why they're being singled out. The manager explains, "There's an issue. Police are on the phone." That alone changes everything. Because now, it's not just a workplace conversation, it's an investigation. And suddenly, everyone involved starts acting differently, more serious, more careful, more obedient. The caller continues, still calm, still controlled. He asks questions. "Where were you earlier? Did you handle cash? Did you interact with customers?" Nothing unusual, just building pressure. Then, the next instruction. "I need you to check her belongings." There's a pause, a small moment of hesitation, but the authority of the situation overrides it. Because if this is real, then refusing could mean interfering with police work. So again, they comply. At this point, something subtle happens. A line is crossed, but no one notices it clearly because it doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, piece by piece, instruction by instruction. Each step only slightly more invasive than the last. And that's what makes it dangerous, because when escalation is slow, it doesn't feel like escalation. It feels like continuation. The caller never hangs up. That's intentional. He stays on the line, guiding, directing, controlling, because the moment the call ends, reality has a chance to return. Questions have a chance to form. Doubt has a chance to grow. So he doesn't allow that. He fills every silence, every pause, every moment of uncertainty with direction. No badge is shown, no officer arrives, no verification is made, and yet everything feels official because authority isn't always about evidence. Sometimes it's about perception, and the caller understands that perfectly. The employee is confused, uncomfortable, but also afraid. Afraid of being accused, afraid of being in trouble, afraid of making things worse. And when fear meets authority, resistance becomes difficult, because what if this is real? What if saying no makes things worse? The manager's in a different kind of pressure. They're responsible, accountable, and now they believe they're assisting law enforcement. So every decision they make feels important, necessary, and justified. Even when something feels off, they push that feeling aside, because the alternative is believing they are disobeying police. What's happening here isn't random, it's psychological. It taps into something deeply human, the instinct to obey authority. The same instinct explored in the Milgram experiment, where ordinary people followed harmful instructions simply because they believed they were supposed to. And that's the terrifying truth. Most people don't see themselves as capable of doing harm until they are placed in the right situation. At some point, there's always a moment, a brief flicker of doubt, a thought that says, "This doesn't feel right." But doubt is quiet, and authority is loud. So the doubt gets buried, ignored, overridden. The caller begins to isolate the situation. He instructs the manager not to involve others, not to call anyone else, not to break the process, because according to him, this is sensitive, confidential, and must be handled carefully. And just like that, the outside world disappears. At this point, everything is in place. Authority is established, trust is built, isolation is created, compliance has begun, and now the caller has full control, not physically, but psychologically. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened again and again, across different locations, different people, different victims, but always the same method, the same voice, the same manipulation. Which raises a terrifying question. If it worked once, how many times could it work again? Because the truth is, this story doesn't stay in one place. It spreads. And what begins as a single phone call becomes something much bigger, much darker, and much harder to stop. All it took was one person willing to lie and others willing to believe. The room is quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't feel natural anymore, because now every action is being watched, every movement directed, not by someone in the room, but by a voice, still on the phone, still calm, still in control. Then the next instruction comes, slightly more invasive than the last. Not shocking, not sudden, just enough to feel like a continuation. And that's how he does it. He never jumps, he steps. This is where the manipulation deepens, because once someone complies once, the second time becomes easier, and the third, even easier than that. Psychologists call this incremental compliance. A gradual shift in behavior where each step feels justified because of the step before it. Nothing feels extreme, because nothing starts extreme. And by the time it is extreme, it no longer feels like it. The caller begins to change his language, subtly, carefully. Instead of direct commands, he frames instructions as necessity. This is procedure. This needs to be done. You're helping an investigation. And with that, responsibility begins to shift. Because now the manager doesn't feel like they're choosing to do something. They feel like they're required to. There's something else happening, something easy to miss. The caller never hesitates, not once, no pauses, no second guessing. And that matters, because confidence is contagious. When someone sounds certain, people assume they are certain. And when they sound authoritative, people assume they are authority. Inside that room, the employee is experiencing something completely different. Confusion has turned into discomfort, discomfort into fear. But the situation feels controlled, structured, official, and that creates a psychological trap. Because when something feels official, it's harder to question, even when it feels wrong. At some point, the employee thinks, this doesn't feel right, but then another thought follows immediately. But what if it's real? And that second thought is the one that wins, because fear of consequences often outweighs discomfort. The caller reinforces control. He instructs the manager, keep the door closed, limit interruptions, do not involve others unnecessarily, and just like that, the situation becomes sealed. No outside voices, no outside perspective, no one to say, stop. In some cases, the caller introduces a new element. He asks for someone else to assist, another employee, sometimes someone older, sometimes someone who seems more responsible. And this changes everything, because now the situation feels even more legitimate, more structured, more official, more real. With more people involved, responsibility becomes shared, and when responsibility is shared, accountability becomes blurred. Each person assumes, if this were wrong, someone else would stop it. But no one does, because everyone is thinking the same thing. There's always a moment, a turning point, where the situation crosses from questionable into clearly wrong. Not ambiguous, not confusing, but undeniably wrong. And yet, it continues. Why? Because by this point, stopping feels harder than continuing. This is the part many people struggle to comprehend. They ask, why didn't they just hang up? Why didn't they refuse? But that question comes from the outside, from a place of clarity. Inside the situation, there is no clarity, only pressure, authority, fear, and a constant voice guiding every move. The caller reinforces the stakes. He implies non-compliance could interfere with an investigation, could lead to legal trouble, could make things worse. And suddenly, following instructions doesn't just feel like obedience, it feels like protection. For the victim, time changes. Moments feel longer, heavier, every second filled with uncertainty. They are no longer just an employee. They are the center of an accusation, and everything happening around them feels like it carries consequences, even when it shouldn't. The manager, meanwhile, is justifying everything internally. This is for a reason. This is temporary. This is necessary. Because the alternative is admitting something is wrong, and once that thought is fully accepted, everything collapses. When others are present, another force comes into play. Social pressure. No one wants to be the one to challenge authority. No one wants to be wrong. No one wants to disrupt what appears to be an official process. So silence continues. And with silence, compliance continues. At this stage, the caller doesn't need to push hard, because the system is now running itself. The people inside the room are enforcing the situation for him. All he has to do is guide it. This pattern didn't happen once. It happened across multiple locations, different cities, different businesses, different victims, but always the same structure, the same manipulation, the same outcome, which means this wasn't luck. It was design. By the time authorities began connecting the dots, dozens of incidents had already occurred. Think about that, dozens. Each one following the same pattern, each one proving how effective this method was, because it didn't rely on force, it relied on human nature. Trust in authority, fear of consequences, desire to do the right thing, reluctance to question instructions, all normal traits, all human traits, all exploited. Eventually, the call ends, sometimes abruptly, sometimes after everything has already happened, and in that silence that follows, reality begins to return, slowly, uncomfortably. Questions start to form. What just happened? Was that real? Why did we do that? And then, the realization hits. There was no officer, no investigation, no authority, just a voice. And with that realization comes something heavy, confusion, guilt, shock, for everyone involved, but especially for the victim. Because what happened wasn't just manipulation, it was a violation of trust, of safety, of basic human boundaries. In many cases, the immediate response wasn't action, it was silence. Because how do you explain something like this? How do you say, we did this because someone told us to? It sounds impossible. And yet, it happened. But silence doesn't last forever. Because patterns leave traces, and eventually, someone notices, someone questions, someone starts connecting the dots. And when they do, this case begins to unravel. Because the most terrifying part of all of this isn't just that people were manipulated, it's how easily it happened. Eventually, someone speaks up, a complaint is filed, then another, and then another. At first, they don't seem connected. Different businesses, different employees, different cities. But the details start to sound familiar. A phone call, a man claiming to be law enforcement, instructions given, compliance followed, and slowly, investigators begin to notice something unsettling. These weren't separate incidents. They were pieces of the same puzzle. When law enforcement starts comparing reports, the similarities are impossible to ignore. The tone of the caller, the structure of the conversation, the escalation pattern. It's all the same, almost scripted, which leads to one conclusion. This is not random, this is deliberate, planned, repeated, and that changes everything. This wasn't a typical case. There were no break-ins, no physical evidence left behind, no witnesses who saw a suspect in person, just voices, memories, and the aftermath, which makes the investigation harder. Because how do you track someone who never physically shows up? Investigators turn to the one tangible lead they have: phone records. Every call leaves a trace, even if it's small, even if it's difficult to follow. So they begin tracking numbers, call durations, locations, patterns, and what they find is both helpful and frustrating. Many of the calls were short. Some routed through systems that made them harder to trace. Others led to dead ends, disconnected numbers, false leads, and that creates a new problem. The suspect knows what he's doing. He's careful, intentional, not impulsive. So investigators shift strategy. If they can't immediately find the person, they can understand the behavior. They begin building a psychological profile. And what emerges is disturbing. The caller is patient. He doesn't rush. He adapts to different people, adjusts his tone, his language, his approach, which suggests something important. He's done this before, not just once or twice, but enough to refine it, perfect it. This wasn't about money. There was no financial gain, no theft, no clear external reward, which leads investigators to a chilling possibility. The motive wasn't material. It was psychological, control, power, influence. the ability to make people obey. Another detail stands out. The targets weren't random, they were specific. Businesses with structured hierarchies, environments where authority matters, places where employees are trained to follow instructions. And within those environments, young employees, often placed in vulnerable positions, which tells investigators something else. This wasn't just manipulation, it was calculated selection. In investigations like this, there's always a moment, a shift, a breakthrough, and in this case, it comes from something small. A call that lasts longer than usual, a trace that holds just enough information, a connection that doesn't disappear, and suddenly, there's a direction. From the data, from the patterns, from the fragments of information, a suspect begins to take shape. Not confirmed, not proven, but present. A person of interest, someone who could be behind the voice. And here's what makes it even more unsettling. The suspect doesn't fit the image people expect. Not visibly threatening, not obviously dangerous, just ordinary, which reinforces a disturbing truth. The most dangerous part of this crime was never how the suspect looked. It was how he sounded when questioned. The suspect denies involvement, calmly, confidently, just like the voice described in the calls. And that creates a complicated situation, because without direct evidence, a voice alone is difficult to prove. Cases like this exist in a gray area. There was no physical presence, no direct force, and yet real harm occurred. And so the question becomes, how do you legally define responsibility in a crime built entirely on manipulation? Investigators gather everything they can, call logs, witness statements, behavioral patterns, but the challenge remains, linking it all directly to one individual, beyond doubt, beyond interpretation. Because in court, that line matters. As details begin to surface, the public reacts, shock, disbelief, confusion. People ask the same question over and over. How could this happen? And more importantly, could this happen to me? The answer is not simple, but it is honest. Yes, under the right circumstances, it could. Because this case didn't rely on weakness, it relied on human behavior. And human behavior is predictable. This brings everything back to one core idea: obedience to authority. In the same principle demonstrated in the Milgram experiment, where ordinary individuals followed harmful instructions because they believed they were supposed to, not because they were cruel, but because they were placed in a situation where obedience felt required. And that forces a shift in perspective. Because this isn't just a story about a caller, or even a series of crimes. It's a story about vulnerability, not physical vulnerability, but psychological. For the victims, the investigation brings mixed emotions. Relief that the truth is emerging, but also a deeper understanding of what happened. And that understanding can be painful because it means confronting the reality of how they were manipulated. For those who followed instructions, there's another layer: guilt, confusion, self-questioning. How did I not see it? Why didn't I stop it? But those questions come after clarity, after distance, after the pressure is gone. Investigators begin to see something bigger. This wasn't just about one individual, it was about a system of behavior, a structure that allowed the manipulation to work. Authority, compliance, isolation, escalation. Remove one, and the system weakens. But together, they create control. The focus changes From confusion to accountability, from isolation to connection, from silence to understanding. But even as answers begin to form, one thing remains clear. Not every part of this story has a clean resolution, because some damage doesn't simply disappear, because in the end, the voice was never the only problem. It was everything that allowed it to be believed. By the time investigators had done everything they could, something still felt incomplete. There were reports, patterns, a suspect, but the kind of closure people expect, the kind that ties everything together neatly, wasn't fully there. And that's what made this case linger, not just in the system, but in people's minds. Cases built on psychological manipulation are some of the hardest to prosecute because there's no physical force, no visible weapon, only influence, suggestion, control. And in a legal system that relies heavily on clear, direct evidence, that creates limitations, which means even when something feels undeniably wrong, proving it in a courtroom is a different challenge entirely. When the story became widely known, the reaction was immediate. Shock, confusion, disbelief, which is people couldn't understand how something like this could happen repeatedly, across different places, with different people. And yet, the pattern was undeniable. One question echoed louder than all the others. Why didn't anyone stop it? It's the question people ask when they're looking at the situation from the outside, with clarity, with distance, with the benefit of hindsight. But inside the moment, there was no clarity, only pressure. Over time, the narrative began to shift, away from simple blame toward understanding. Because what this case revealed wasn't just individual decisions, it was human behavior under influence. And that distinction matters because it changes the conversation from judgment to awareness. For the victims, the story didn't end when the calls stopped. What happened stayed with them, and in ways that don't always show. Trust was affected, confidence shaken, safety redefined, and perhaps most difficult of all, the knowledge that what happened was real, even if it felt unreal in the moment, in many cases. The aftermath wasn't loud, it wasn't public, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, private, internal. The kind of impact that doesn't always get seen, but is deeply felt. For the people who carried out the instructions, there's another layer, a difficult one, because they have to live with the realization that they participated, even if they didn't understand it at the time, even if they believed they were doing the right thing. That kind of realization, doesn't fade easily. It's important to make a distinction. Understanding how something happened is not the same as excusing it. Both can exist at the same time. Because recognizing the psychological factors involved doesn't erase the harm, but it does help explain it. An explanation is how prevention begins. This case left behind something valuable, not just as a story, but as a warning. It showed that authority can be imitated, that confidence can be misleading, and that instructions should always be questioned when they cross boundaries. Looking back, there's one thing that could have changed everything. A single question: can I verify this? That moment of pause, that break in the flow, that refusal to continue blindly, because manipulation depends on momentum, and questioning disrupts it. If there's one takeaway from all of this, it's this: authority should never replace judgment. No matter how confident someone sounds, no matter how official something feels, no matter how urgent the situation seems, because real authority can withstand verification. Fake authority depends on avoiding it. Even now, this case is discussed, analyzed, referenced, not because of how it ended, but because of what it revealed. It exposed something universal, something uncomfortable, something real. At the center of everything is the human mind, the way it responds to pressure, the way it seeks direction, the way it trusts structure. And under the right conditions, that can be used against it. It all started with something simple, a phone call, a voice, a moment that didn't seem important at first. And that's what makes it so unsettling, because nothing about it looked dangerous. The truth is, this case wasn't built on force. It was built on belief. Belief in authority, belief in process, belief in doing the right thing. And that belief was manipulated. The most disturbing part of this story isn't just what happened, it's how easily it happened. No threats, no violence, no visible danger, just a voice that sounded like it should be trusted. And that's what made it dangerous, because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't something you can see, it's something you believe.